Mankind has produced some really big weapons over the years. Pop down to Fort Ranello in Malta, for example, and bolted to the top of it you will find these Armstrong 100-ton guns. No prizes for guessing how much they weigh. Similarly, although there isn't any of them still knocking about nowadays, the Germans also made use of these 42cm Gamma howitzers during World War I, each of them weighing in at 150 tons. But even guns such as those are but pea shooters when you start getting into the world of railway guns. Take the BL 18-inch railway howitzer, for example, the UK's go-to railway gun during World War II. It came in at a mighty 180 tons. However, even that doesn't even touch the sides of the matter when you start looking at the really big ones. If we want to see the biggest, we have to break out the big scales and look at a railway gun that weighed thousands of tons. And here it is, the mighty Schwerer Gustav. Among its many records are being the largest caliber rifled weapon ever used in combat, the heaviest mobile artillery piece ever built, and using the heaviest shells ever lobbed out of an artillery piece. Want to know more? Of course you do, just look at the thing. So, let's get on giving this monster a proper once-over. Let's begin with the most interesting thing about any whopping great weapon, its design. And as you have no doubt ascertained from how we hyped it up in the introduction, the word for the Schwerer Gustav is big, as the thing really was one of the single most ambitious feats of engineering in all military history. Weighing 1,350 tons when fully assembled, the gun had a bore of 80 centimeters, i.e. big enough to climb down and have plenty of room around your shoulders. Further to that, it also had an overall length of 47.3 meters, a barrel length of 32.5 meters, and a height of 11.6 meters and a width of 7.1. That, naturally, is rather big, but just how big is it really, as these numbers can be hard to actually contextualize? Well, here's a handy picture that puts it into perspective. See the teeny tiny little red dot and the equally diddly black one on the left? Yep, they're people. This thing truly was enormous. And a big gun naturally fires big rounds, which for the Schwerer Gustav came in the form of either a high explosive or an armor-piercing shell. The high explosives ones were constructed with a steel casing filled with 700 kilograms of just explosive material, with the whole round itself weighing in at 4.8 tons. They had a maximum range of 47 kilometers, and despite their insane mass, still left the muzzle at supersonic speeds, specifically around 820 meters per second, as compared to a rough sea level speed of 340 meters for sound. The armor-piercing shells, on the other hand, were even bigger still, weighing in at 7.1 tons and could penetrate up to 7 meters of reinforced concrete or 1 meter of steel armor plate. Their extra beefiness naturally didn't exactly improve their ballistics, with them only able to be fired for 38 kilometers and leave the muzzle with a velocity of 720 meters per second. Such an absurdly proportioned design required the use of 2 parallel railway tracks to support it, with the tracks being specifically made from some of the toughest and hardiest steel the Reich could produce. Normal steel simply wouldn't have cut it, as even with the weight being distributed down onto 2 different sets of tracks across 80 wheels, normal steel tracks simply buckled and deformed under the immense load. And even with those fancy custom-made rails, they still had to be laid on top of a concrete foundation when the gun was fully assembled for firing. This also created a peculiar vernacular dichotomy, because while the term railway gun might conjure images of a gun that was, well, mobile, in reality, the Schwerer Gustav was mobile only in the most abstract sense of the word. Relocatable would probably be the better word, because with the thing having to be assembled, have custom tracks built, and have a concrete foundation laid before firing, it wasn't exactly as if Mr. Hitler was just pulling his toy up on some random branch line, letting a few shots off, and then scarpering off again double quick. In fact, if you want to know exactly how long it took 3 days to actually get the thing set up, firing from a new location. Even transporting it wasn't exactly simple, because you'd have to spend 3 days again taking it back apart, and then it had to be transported on a 1.5 kilometer long 25 wagon train, aboard which was also crammed the 500 personnel required for assembly and later firing, but it also took 2,500 labourers who were needed for track preparation, although often they were just found locally and weren't brought along as permanent staff. The firing process itself was equally labour intensive. Of the 500 men who would contribute to the effort, there would be loaders who would transport and position the massive shells using specialised trolleys and cranes, artillerymen who would manage the precise alignment of the gun for targeting, and engineers responsible for operating the traverse, elevation and firing mechanisms. There was also a dedicated safety team who not only ensured that the surrounding area was clear before firing, but who also kept an eye on the structural integrity of the gun's barrel and breech before firing. There was a hell of a lot of force in one of those shots after all, and the risk of a catastrophic failure was always a very real one. Just to be safe too, the gun was always accompanied by 2 entire anti-aircraft battalions, since it was quite the tempting target after all, and a German battalion, for reference, which usually numbered around 1,000 men. As a result of all that, the Schwertgustav wasn't exactly what you'd call a rapid-fire weapon, and with its crew working at max pelt, it could typically get off around every 30 to 45 minutes, a length of time that included not just the physical reloading of the weapon, but also time for repositioning and recalibrating it after the enormous force of its last shot blew everything out of whack. So that's the gun in question then. Let us now move on and start learning about its history. Unfortunately, while we understand the technical specifications of the Schwertgustav very well indeed, its actual history is far more complicated, chiefly due to the fact that every source you consult has a totally different timeline of events that it claims is true. For example, Wikipedia claims the following about the Schwertgustav. Quote, in 1934, the German Army High Command, Oberkommando des Heeres, OKH, commissioned Krupp of Essen to design a gun to destroy the forts of the French Maginot Line that were nearing completion. World War II database, by comparison, states this, quoting again, the gigantic 80-centimeter cannon known as Gustav owed its origin to a 1935 Wehrmacht study into what would be needed to penetrate the thickness of concrete being boasted of in French newspapers in the newly completed Maginot Line. And don't worry, we don't depend upon online sources when producing these videos, we just use them to gain a base understanding of the facts before later expanding with more expansive book sources, just as our writer was taught to both in his history degree and when he was getting his tentative starts in academic publishing. That qualifier aside, those quotes lead us to a vital matter we wish to draw attention to, that being, how the hell are we meant to know which is the correct claim and which is the duff one, when we don't have an ability to take it back to primary sources, i.e. those which are contemporary to the events they discuss. Put simply, we can't. So with that in mind, we opted to do the only thing that we were realistically able to, and that was completely disregard the initial scooping up the pop history sources stage of the research and just put all of our faith into a book. Specifically, this book, Railway Guns of World War II by Stephen J. Zaloga. We chose that one partly due to the fact that its publishers, Osprey, typically have a high standard of quality control and rarely put out a junk book, but also due to the fact that Mr. Zaloga is a very serious name in military history, having published dozens of well-received works over his 40-year career. So while there's a slight question mark over the information we're presenting, we'll be buggered if we aren't half certain in it nonetheless. Having said that then, what does the book in question have to tell us about Schwertgustav's development? Well, it says that in the mid-1930s, Krupp and Waffenamt, the German Army Weapons Agency, explored the idea of developing super heavy artillery to breach the French Maginot Line, considering gun calibers between 700mm and 1000mm. But that the Waffenamt eventually dismissed the idea as impractical given the exorbitant cost and logistical challenges such a weapon would entail. That will change in 1936 though, when Hitler visited the Krupp facility in Essen and saw preliminary sketches of the design. Known for his fascination with grandiose projects, Hitler really liked what he saw and approved the development of an 80-centimeter railway gun in 1937. The weapon, designated the KE, was intended to be ready for the 1940 campaign against France, specifically to target the Maginot Line as originally intended. Do note too that KE was the Schwertgustav's proper name, the one that was written on its design documents, logistical paperwork, the lot. Schwerter actually comes from the nickname of the second gun produced, but we'll get into explaining that more soon enough. Work progressed slower than had been hoped, with test firings not beginning until nearly a year after initially planned, specifically in late 1940 at a firing range in Hillesleben, a tiny little village in the Saxony-Anhalt province. From there, the whole first gun, as in both the shooty bit and trainy bit, was completed towards the back end of 1941 and was then moved to Ruggenwald Proving Ground in what was then East Prussia, now is Poland. As for the matter of cost, the sticker price for a KE was give or take 7 million Reichsmark. However, this figure doesn't factor in the astronomical costs of specialized factory tooling and production equipment, all of which had to be developed and procured just for making the KE. But while we don't know the true total cost, that particular figure long since having been lost to history, we do know that the sticker price alone was equivalent to 25 Tiger I tanks, just to give you a working frame of reference. Come early in 1942 though, the first KE was finally declared combat ready, with it being named Dora, in honor of the wife of Erich Müller, Krupp's head of gun design. By late 1942, a second KE was also completed, with this one being named Schwerter II, after the then leader of Krupp, Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Haubach. Work did begin on a third KE, but it was never completed due to it being damaged beyond repair in a 1944 bombing raid. This version would have used a longer barrel, but with a thinner bore, specifically one of only 52 centimeters. This change was done to allow it to fire the then newly developed super long-range rocket boosted ammunition, which needed to be both lighter and have the propellant gas of the powder charge acting on it for as long as possible to really squeeze out the extra kilometers of range. We don't exactly know how far this one was intended to shoot, and with it never being completed, it's a moot point anyway. And speaking of things being moot, the KE, which we'll go back to calling this Schwerter now because it rolls off the tongue better, actually had quite the lackluster service history given the vast number of resources that the Nazi state sunk into its completion. For example, one early proposal would have seen the Schwerter racing down the Iberian Peninsula so that they could give Gibraltar the business as part of Operation Felix, the German invasion of the aforementioned British colony. Such a plan depended on Franco's cooperation, however, so when he opted to stay neutral-ish and didn't bring Spain into the war, Operation Felix and the Schwerter role in it was cancelled. Instead, it would be used during the siege of Sevastopol, where the Schwerter, specifically Dora, would first see combat in June 1942. After the Herculean construction effort to get it ready to go, Dora first let rip on the 5th of June, firing 15 high explosive and armor-piercing shells on its first day. Its accuracy left much to be desired, however, with an average miss distance of 300 meters as relayed back to the crew by advanced spotter parties. The accuracy improved with time, however, as the crew became more familiar with their vast weapon, and by the 11th of June, they were actually hitting things. Things still weren't great, however, with only 3 hits against Port Siberia having been recorded on that day. By the 17th, things are noted as having become better, whatever that exactly meant, and we don't have the actual hit numbers for that time. What we do know is that by that time, Dora was really letting rip, as it was in the opening stages of a protracted 2-week barrage against a wealth of targets such as Fort Maxim Gorky, Fort Stalin, and basically anything else made of Soviet concrete that happened to be in range. Accuracy remained a problem, however, and despite having fired a total of 48 shells during the Sevastopol deployment, the crew never really managed to get the knack of making accurate shots. Although, as you can see from photos such as this, there's certainly no doubting the destructive damage of the shots when they did land. If you consider that performance to be a bit, well, then you aren't alone in that assessment, as German High Command certainly agree with you, with Dora's contribution to the siege being considered as negligible at best compared to the 563,000 rounds that conventionally artillery pieces managed to get off during the siege. A little something extra too, at one point of the siege, it was decided that Dora should destroy Whitecliff, an enormous undersea ammunition storage that was shielded by both water and concrete. And while it did destroy it with spectacular effect, it took 9 shots to do so. As for what they got up to during the rest of the war, neither Dora nor Schwerter II really did much at all. Ultimately, while they made for cracking propaganda pieces, as demonstrated by basically any photo of them ever. They just weren't that useful as functional artillery pieces thanks to their poor accuracy, and the German High Command was bitterly aware of that fact. We also aren't hyperbolizing when we say that they didn't do much else too. Take Dora. After Sevastopol, it was transported up north to lend a hand at Leningrad, the powers that be reasoning that if it was no good for precision strikes against specific targets, there was no way it could ever miss a city. So just get up there and start blatting off rounds to generally help out with that particular meat grinder. And yet, after the enormous logistical operation that was moving the gun that far up north, it did nothing. They didn't even bother to assemble it. Instead, it just sat there, gathering dust in silence. From there, the story gets patchy, but it seems that whatever the Schwerter-Gustavs were doing, they weren't shooting, with the German High Command basically having given up on them. Supposedly, the last time they were seen anywhere near a front line was in Warsaw around the time of its 1944 uprising, but again, the vast majority of sources say that they never fired a single shot in anger there, either to logistical difficulties in getting them set up that late in the war, or simply because the rising had long since been crushed by the time they were assembled. And that pretty much is it. Schwerter-Gustav II was destroyed on the 14th of April 1945 by its own crew in a forest just north of the town of Auerbach in Germany, due to the fact that its crew had decided to throw in the towel and surrender to the Americans the following day, and they wanted to deny their soon-to-be captors such a grand prize. Similarly, Dora was destroyed by its crew just outside of the town of Grafenrohr on the 19th of April before they too surrendered to the Americans. Both the Soviets and the Americans poured over the wreckages of the once great guns and did all manner of science on them, but then, when their curiosity had been satisfied, they scrapped them, with basically everything being gone by 1950. All in all then, the Schwerter-Gustav was that most quintessential of Nazi engineering projects. It was big, it was complicated, and despite looking bloody impressive on a Polaroid, it was actually complete junk, being barely able to hit anything and gobbling up a huge amount of resources while not doing so. To further put into perspective just how much of a waste they were, we've done some rough maths, working with the nice and easy, if not entirely representative figure of 7 million Reichsmarks that we gave earlier. For the same price as one Schwerter-Gustav, the Nazi war machine could have purchased 173 15cm SFH-18 heavy howitzers, 427 10.5cm LEFH 18 medium howitzers, or 1,826 7.5 LEIG 18 instead. And sure, while every one of those wouldn't exactly be pulling off the occasionally impressive fortress-shattering shots that the Schwerter-Gustav did when it could actually hit its target, given that every one of those was logistically nice and easy, it didn't take 3 days to set up and required a crew you could count on one hand rather than a crew of actual thousands, it's a hard case to argue that the Schwerter-Gustav, while impressive and, let's be frank, cool, wasn't just a colossal waste of money, innit?